Have the laws of war been breached in Gaza? The killing of civilians and collective punishment raises concerns as Israel bombs the Strip. So who will hold those responsible to account? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Israel's devastating airstrikes and blockade of Gaza after the surprise attack by Hamas have led to both sides being accused of violating international humanitarian law. A UN commission says it's collecting evidence of war crimes allegedly committed by Israel and Hamas. Israel says it's observing international law. The International Criminal Court can launch an investigation to determine whether casualties in Gaza and Israel are a violation. But Israel doesn't recognise the ICC's jurisdiction. For 9 consecutive days, Gaza has shaken under relentless Israeli strikes. Entire neighbourhoods have been turned to rubble after Israel dropped thousands of bombs. These indiscriminate attacks on civilians violate Article 25 of the Hague Conventions. Since Hamas killed 1,300 Israelis during its military offensive nearly 10 days ago, the Israeli military has imposed a total siege on Gaza. The enclave was already under a land, air and sea blockade for 16 years. Palestinians and aid workers say a lack of food, medicine, fuel and basic supplies has made the situation there catastrophic. Under the 4th Geneva Convention, Israel, as the occupying power, is prohibited from deporting or transferring part of the population from the land it occupies. But last week, Israel issued an ultimatum for 1.1 million Palestinians in the northern part of the enclave to leave their homes. We'll go to our panel of guests in a moment, but first, Seth Varson has this report from The Hague.
With thousands of civilian deaths and the situation in Gaza escalating, calls for international justice are growing, and all eyes are here now on the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But so far, the ICC has not made any formal announcement that it will step up its investigation into possible war crimes committed by Israel or Hamas. In 2021, the ICC decided that it has jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territories, even though Israel doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court. Numerous cases have been filed since then, including the killing of Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed by Israeli soldiers in 2022. But so far, no progress has been announced, let alone arrest warrants issued. This is in contrast with what happened after Russia invaded Ukraine. 5 days later, the prosecutor announced that he will start a formal investigation, and since then an arrest warrant against President Vladimir Putin has been issued. A full blockade of Gaza is considered a war crime and possible genocide according to international law experts. The ICC has denied our request for an interview. Step Fasten for Inside Story in The Hague.
Let's bring in our guests. In London, we have Geoffrey Robertson, founder of Doughty Street Chambers and former president of the War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone. Geoffrey was appointed by the UN as distinguished jurist member on its Justice Council. In Haifa, we have Sosan Zahir, human rights lawyer and legal advisor for the Civil Society Coalition for Emergency and Arab Society. And in New York, we have Mark Galasco. He's military advisor at the Dutch NGO Pax for Peace. Mark was in Gaza during the Operation Cast Lead, that was the Israeli war in 2009, to investigate the conduct of war. He also instructs war crimes investigators at the Institute of International Criminal Investigations. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I want to start with you, Geoffrey, because the rules of law, we hear all these terms, IHL, International Humanitarian Law, LOAC, Law of Armed Conflict. There's a Latin phrase, just in bello, and there's a thing that everyone, I think, has heard of, but no one really quite understands all the details, the Geneva Conventions. I'm going to ask you, Geoffrey, to start our conversation off. Give us the 90-second version. What are the rules of war?
The rules of law are not rules of war. The rules of war have been with us for hundreds of years. Don't kill civilians. Don't rush to trial or execute enemies without fair trial. Or don't kill a prisoner who surrenders. They've been rules of law for centuries. In 1999, in what is called the Rome Statute, the rules of law were put in fairly straightforward English. They banned the taking of hostages. They banned the use of starvation as a tactic, which seems to be going on now in Gaza. They protected at all times civilians unless they got messed up in the war. So they are the rules of war, fairly clear. But
Jeffrey,
just
to be clear, are these binding on every country and every armed group?
They are binding on countries that signed up to the International Criminal Court, and that's 123 countries. But they are not binding on Russia, which commits war crimes every few hours in Ukraine. They are not binding on America, which refuses to sign in the fear that one day an American soldier may be prosecuted in The Hague. And they are not binding on Israel, which of course refuses to sign. So they have a defect in that although we can say that Israel, for example, or Russia is clearly committing a war crime, and Mr. Putin is committing one clearly of aggression by invading Ukraine, the problem of taking anyone to court and punishing them for that criminality, and indeed that barbaric criminality when it comes to bombing civilians, is limited. And only if Mr. Putin or some Air Force commander who's bombed a civilian residence is captured in Sweden or in Europe somewhere, is there any prospect of putting them on trial? So you can say that war crimes have a catch-as-catch-can quality about them. Only if you catch a war criminal outside his country that will protect him can war crimes be punished.
So, San, if I can come to you as we move to the specific region of the world we're talking about, Israel and Palestine, this very, very long conflict. There's an important thing, I think, before we talk about the details. We've heard the background from Jeffrey on the rules of war, but Israel is seen legally as the occupying power. What does that mean?
This means that since 1967, Israel is abided by several obligations based on international law and the law of occupation, which one of the most important and basic regulation of them is basically to protect the civilians and to make distinction between civilians and combatants. Now, in 2005, we all know that Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip, but it still had an obligations based on IHL because of the fact that it imposed severe blockade since a few months after Cast-led in 2007 and until today. So Israel has obligations. Israel is obligated to protect civilians. It is obligated to not to attack and not to violate all the articles that are included and anchored not only in the Rome Statute but also in the Geneva Conventions and in the Hague Regulation, which put basically the obligation on Israel not only to not hurt civilians, but also not to attack infrastructures that give services for civilians, such as electricity, water, fuel. And when you look at the history especially from since the blockade was imposed until now, basically, we see that Israel has controlled all these basic services and on a very minimum humanitarian level. And even the Israeli Supreme Court in petitions that reached the Israeli Supreme Court to supply more electricity, more fuel to enable the freedom of movement in and out from Gaza, even to the West Bank, and not only in and out of Gaza abroad. We saw that the intervention by the Supreme Court was very, very limited, which also itself said that despite the disengagement, Israel still have some minimum obligations based on IHL. Which
okay, let me bring in Mark now, if you may. Mark, you have a different perspective on this. You were in 2009, you were in Gaza. You were a war crimes investigator. You're a former military officer. Before we talk about the specifics of what's happened in the last 10 days, how easy or difficult is your work from afar? I would assume that the fact we now have social media, we have so much more video and photo evidence, that helps you a great deal.
Well, first, let me just open by saying that we at Pax for Peace are concerned with the civilian populations of both Israel and Gaza, whether those are Israelis that are currently in Gaza as captives, or if they're Palestinians or Israelis that are currently under fire on either side of the border. Indeed, social media has now become a part of the conflict, and conflicts, as we've seen, not only in the Israel-Gaza situation, but also looking at things such as Ukraine. One would think would assist war crimes investigators, but in fact, the preponderance of disinformation makes it very difficult. You know, I look to Bellingcat, for example, which is an open source investigating organization in the United Kingdom, and also Air Wars, which is another NGO there that does open source investigations to try to determine whether or not civilians have been killed in conflicts. And their work has been greatly complicated by this preponderance of misinformation and disinformation. But let's make it very clear that both Hamas and Israel have positive obligations under international law, the Geneva Conventions, to protect civilians, whether they are in airstrikes in the way that the airstrikes are planned and conducted, or if they are allowing Palestinians to flee, to protect the Palestinians on the ground within Gaza. These are obligations under international law, and all parties are responsible for that.
Jeffrey, let me take you now to the specific events of the last 10 days, and first to October the 7th, a carefully planned, audacious attack by Hamas killed over 1,400 Israelis, about 120 captives have been taken to Gaza. Are these war crimes?
Yes, clearly they are. They are obscene examples of war crimes, of killing civilians and capturing them and holding them as hostage. This is an ongoing war crime, and it gives Israel a right of self-defense to pursue them, to capture them, to put them on trial. But there are limits, obviously, to that right. And the time of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth that you find in the Bible is long gone. That seems to be, in part, the Israeli reaction, and it's a wrong, unethical reaction by
So, Jeffrey,
standards.
when you hear this complete siege blocking all the electricity and water, although they're allowing a little bit of water now back to south of Gaza, fuel, food, medicine, do you see that as collective punishment? And is collective punishment in itself, is that a war crime?
It is a war crime. I could give you the... There is a section of the Rome Statute which precisely defines what are attempts at starvation. At the end of the day, is the war crime, and the cutting off of crucial civilian supplies to keep civilians alive is a war crime. The transporting of civilians outside the country is also a war crime, at little noticed, but it's there, and it covers the American-supported attempt to put the 1 million or so Gazans, throw them out of the country via the small aperture in Egypt. That amounts to transporting a civilian population outside the state. So, yes, there are a number of crimes that are in prospect, although it may be that America, Mr. Blinken in Egypt and others are attempting to persuade the Israelis not to pursue it. So we haven't got to the stage yet, but we may in the next couple of days of criminal behavior by way of starving the population or extirpating the population out of their territory and into the deserts of Egypt, which seems to be one of the plans.
Mark, you are clearly watching what is going on in terms of the military efforts by Israel. You were there in 2009. This, though, is the deadliest Gaza war so far. In fact, 6,000 bombs in 6 days. That's the last time the Israeli military published a statistic. That's more than the number used by the US in its entire battle against ISIL in Raqqa in Syria. It's more used in 6 days than the US used in Afghanistan in a single year. Now, does that give you the view that this is probably a war crime, that they are just raining bombs on the civilian population?
Well, look, the obligation to protect civilians in conflict is a clear one. And really the mark of a professional military is its ability to protect civilians while it is conducting offensive operations. And if the Israeli Defense Forces believe that the laws of armed conflict and international humanitarian law is holding them back from their offensive operations, then perhaps it shows that they do not concern themselves as much with the protection of civilians and the stopping of civilian harm than they should. Look, I worked in the Pentagon during the Iraq War in 2003 and participated in many dozens, if not hundreds, of airstrikes. And you have to understand the amount of work that goes into that, into planning, identifying, and validating your target. Once you have the target identified, you also have to conduct a legal analysis. The lawyers have to look at each individual target and determine whether you can strike it with distinction, meaning that you're going to hit a military object and not a civilian object, and also proportionally, right? So that the damage done, whatever that damage may be, is not so widespread that the civilian harm outweighs whatever military gain that you're going to get. Additionally, militaries also conduct what's called a collateral damage estimation, in which they try to ascertain how many civilians are going to be killed in each strike. They do this beforehand. This is a macabre calculus that is all put together prior to each individual strike. Now, when we look at the pace of operations in Gaza, 6,000 airstrikes in 6 days, that's 1,000 a day. That is an incredibly high number of strikes for such a tiny area. In fact, it's somewhat akin to what the U.S. military was doing in Iraq for the entire country during the Iraq War in 2003. Now we're talking about a small postage stamp. So it does raise the question and concerns of whether or not the Israeli military is taking all feasible precautions to protect civilians in these airstrikes.
And the airstrikes have continued, Sausan, and as Jeffrey mentioned earlier on, during this, they've asked the population of the biggest urban conurbation within Gaza, although it is a hugely densely populated, all of the Strip, but the Gaza City and the North, 1.1 million people, initially in just 24 hours to move. I mean, is this a war crime?
I think that based on the international and the IHL norms, it clearly is amounted as a war crime, because the most two important things, I think, this time with Israel's war on Gaza, rather than when we were examining it in the war during August 2014, are two most important things. First of all, the intent and the willingness of Israel and what its intent is in terms of the intention of what to destroy, how to destroy, what kind of commands to give to civilians in Gaza, where to move, and also the results, the massiveness of the killing of innocent people. Like, just take the number, not just about the 6,000 missile. We are talking about 8 days or 9 days since October 7, with at least 2,700 being killed in Gaza, while more than 1,000 people who were women and children. And we saw the attack on civilians when they were told to evacuate southbound. So, and when we see that there are at least 55 families that were killed in total, all the family members. So the massiveness and the intent. And when we learn about, when we read and hear the intentions of Israeli officials, of the Minister of Defense, on how they are dealing, all of these are indicators in examining the components of a war crime or even genocide, because these articles in the Rome Statute, they are very clear, they have very clear components. Other than examining the collateral damage and distincting between civilians and combatants, the willfulness and the intent are very much important to examine. And unfortunately, the responses and the statements from what we see and hear, together with the result, like even UN officials, which I would like to refer to, like Mrs. Francesca Albanese, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, said that the massive killing of innocent is the thing that should be examined here. To compare with the people that were killed, or with the total numbers so far, 2,700, while in more than 1 month, or it was 50 days, the attack on Gaza or operation on Gaza in August 2014, there were 2,500.
Jeffrey, go on. Go on, Jeffrey.
The evidence is clear that war crimes have been committed. We just see the statistics, the numbers we can see on television, children's bodies being brought out. There is no question that war crimes are being committed. If it's genocide, that's an open question, although there has to be genocidal intent, and that's difficult to prove. It could be that Israel will claim that it is going into Gaza to release those who are being held hostage, or
Jeffrey,
to disarm.
Jeffrey, on this evacuation order, if I may, just to be clear in international law, because I think this is important if the Israeli military is about to intervene, the sick, the elderly, the children, those that can't move, Israel will say they gave warning. But does it, under international law, does Israel still have an obligation to protect those people?
It's not a defense in international law to give warning. What you are doing is transporting or ordering by way of backing up your order with guns, rockets, and aeroplanes. You are forcing a civilian population out of the country. You are forcing them, first of all, south, and then through a bolt hole that may be a humanitarian corridor if Mr. Blinken succeeds, or may not, may be closed. So there's no way. But the force is to leave your country and camp in the desert as refugees. And that certainly is a war crime. And many children, many people who've got no connection with Hamas. So although Israel has a right of self-defense, that is not a right, a license to kill or do anything other than conduct yourself with due regard to humanitarian principles. And
Mark, if I could bring Mark in now, as a war crimes investigator, when you hear 24 health facilities, including 6 hospitals damaged, at least 23 ambulances targeted, UN sites, 23 sites of UNRWA, the UN agency that deals with the Palestinians, damaged by airstrikes. Are those things you'd be investigating as well?
Well, absolutely. You know, all of these issues I'd be investigating. To speak to the law on the displacement of the population and giving effective warning, Article 57 of AP1, Additional Protocol 1 of 1977, is fairly clear. It says to militaries that you should give warning if at all possible. The Israelis have given warning. They've in fact given some fairly specific warnings to the population. The question is, are those realistic? Can the population take them? But more importantly, even if Israel does provide warning, it does not then make it a free fire zone, right? They still have to take all the precautions that they would be taking even had they not provided that warning. So it doesn't.
Let me
give
bring in
them
Sausan, because we're coming to the end of our discussion, and I do want to talk about accountability, because we've had already 4 previous Gaza wars: 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. There were allegations of war crimes in all of them, and no one ever went to court, did they?
Yeah, that's correct. And you know,
sorry, Mark, this is for Sausan. This is for Sausan. Sausan, go ahead, please.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, we human rights organizations have since 2000 and since Castlet calling for investigating war crimes, and we know all what happened with the commission of inquiry led back then by Mr. Goldstone. But on the other hand, we know that Palestine signed the Rome Statute and gave the entitlement to investigate only after July 2014. So even if we want to call for investigating war crimes, it should be by the ICC investigated only of acts that have been conducted from that date. And I think that the development of the recent from a year and a half ago from the ICC, that it does have jurisdiction to investigate war crimes in all Palestinian territory, occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, then yes, there should be a very clear call to investigate these crimes. I think that with what we are seeing today, time has come to act on having a decision and opening war crimes of the killing of innocents, and especially women and children.
Sausan, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our panel today. Jeffrey Robinson, Sausan Zahir and Mark Galasco. Hopefully, perhaps like me, you're more informed about the laws of war. If you want to see this programme again, it's available to watch anytime on aljazeera.com. If you've got comments about the Gaza war or our coverage of it, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can post, I have to remind myself they're no longer called tweets, on X. Find us at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and all the team here in Doha. Stay safe and see you soon.